If someone had told me 10 years ago when I first started hauling props for traveling stage shows that I'd end up here, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the dry, rustling sound I make when I'm trying to deflect a truth too sharp to handle. My life was a meticulously organized collection of backstage shadows and quiet routines. I was the man behind the curtain, the one who made sure the dove was in the hat and the wires were invisible. My world was built on the principle of being unseen, and I had become an expert at it. Then Julian came along, a supernova in a tuxedo, and burned my quiet world to the ground. I didn't come to the Orpheum Grand looking for love. I came looking for a steady paycheck and a place to be invisible for a 6-week residency. The theater was a beautiful, decaying old dame, all velvet and gilt and the ghostly smell of dust and forgotten perfume. My domain was the labyrinth of corridors behind the stage, a world of ropes, sandbags, and rolling cases stenciled with the name, Julian the Magnificent. Even his name felt like a performance. Loud, unapologetic, everything I was not. I saw him for the first time on load-in day. He stood center stage, a single ghost light painting him in stark relief, and he didn't just occupy the space. He commanded it. He was tall, built with the solid, grounded strength of a man who works with his hands, not just his words. His hair was dark, a chaotic mess that seemed to defy the very idea of a comb, and his jaw was a sharp, uncompromising line. From my vantage point in the wings, he was less a person and more a piece of living architecture, a monument to a confidence I couldn't comprehend. My job was simple. I managed his props. I maintained the intricate clockwork of his illusions, polished the mirrors until they were slivers of pure light, and reset the traps that made women disappear. I knew the secrets to his magic. I knew the false bottoms, the hidden levers, the precise angles of deception. In a way, I knew him more intimately than anyone in his adoring audience. But I didn't know the man at all. I only knew the machine. The distance between us was more than the 30 feet of stage. It was a professional chasm, a hierarchy as rigid as the theater's cast-iron framework. He was the star. I was the crew. He spoke in declarations, his voice a low baritone that carried to the back row without a microphone. I spoke only when asked a direct question, and even then, my answers were clipped, efficient, designed to end the interaction as quickly as possible. He rarely used my name. I was props, or sometimes just a pointed finger in a curt instruction. The cards need to be reset. Check the tension on the levitation rig. I didn't mind. It was easier that way. Being a function, not a person, meant I could observe him without the messy complication of being seen in return. And I did observe. It was a secret, shameful hobby. I watched the way his hands, large and surprisingly graceful, could manipulate a deck of cards into a fluid waterfall of red and black. I watched the way his eyes, a shade of gray that seemed to absorb the stage lights, would scan the audience, finding the one person whose belief he needed to sell the trick. I saw the tension in his shoulders before a big illusion and the almost imperceptible slump of relief when the applause crashed over him. This secret admiration festered into something else, a longing so sharp and specific it felt like a physical ache in my chest. It was a stupid, pointless crush, a schoolboy fantasy played out in the dusty wings of a forgotten theater. He was Julian the Magnificent. I was Leo, the guy who made sure his props didn't fail. We were two different species. The routine was my shield. Load in, set up, run cues, reset, load out. For 2 weeks, it worked. I kept my head down, my thoughts to myself, and my heart locked in a box far more secure than any of his illusions. I was safe in my solitude, insulated by the familiar hum of the stage machinery and the predictable rhythm of the show. Then came the quantum leap. It was his signature piece, the grand finale, a massive, ornate cabinet, a steampunk contraption of polished mahogany, brass gears, and whirling dials. He would step inside, the heavy door would be bolted shut, and a moment later, he would appear at the back of the theater. It was a masterpiece of misdirection and engineering, a secret I guarded as fiercely as he did. The disruption came not with a bang, but with a sickening crunch. The trucking company had mishandled the crate. When we opened it, The main door of the quantum leap was splintered, and the delicate, irreplaceable brass gearing that ran the internal mechanism was bent and mangled. Julian didn't shout. He didn't rage. He just stood there, staring at the wreckage, and the silence that emanated from him was more terrifying than any outburst. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. In that moment, he wasn't magnificent. He looked breakable. "It can't be fixed," the tour manager said, his voice a nervous squeak. "We'll have to cut it from a show." Julian finally moved, his head snapping up. "No," he said, the single word a shard of ice. "It will be fixed." He looked around, his gray eyes sweeping over the crew, dismissing each of them, until they landed on me. "You," he said. "Not Leo. You. You know the mechanism better than anyone." It wasn't a question. "We'll fix it together," he declared. Downstairs, in the old workshop, and just like that, my routine was shattered. The inciting incident wasn't the broken box. It was him saying the word together. The workshop was in the sub-basement, a place forgotten by time. It smelled of damp stone, sawdust, and rust. A single, bare bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting a pool of watery yellow light that seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive shadows. We hauled the damaged pieces of the cabinet down a narrow, winding staircase, the effort forcing us into a clumsy, grunting choreography. This was the beginning of our forced proximity. A dusty, subterranean prison for two. For the first few hours, we worked in near total silence. The only sounds were the scrape of metal on wood, the frustrated hiss of Julian's breath, and the frantic, trapped bird flutter of my own heart. He was a whirlwind of focused energy, stripping away the broken pieces with a raw, controlled violence. I was a shadow, handing him tools, cleaning components, my movements small and precise, trying to take up as little space as possible. But you can only be invisible for so long in a 10 by 10 foot room. The small space forced an intimacy I was not prepared for. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap, mixed with the sharper tang of sweat and metal. I was close enough to see the tiny, dark flecks in the gray of his irises, the way his brow furrowed into two deep lines when he was concentrating. These were details I was never meant to see, close-ups from a forbidden film. He worked with his jacket off, the sleeves of his black shirt rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. And his hands. I had always admired them from afar, but up close, I saw they weren't the pristine hands of a performer. They were the hands of a maker. There were calluses on his palms, a small, faded white scar across one knuckle, faint traces of grease etched into the lines of his skin. These hands didn't just perform magic, they built it. I was studying the schematics, old blueprints spread across a dusty workbench, when I noticed the weariness in him. It wasn't just frustration with the broken prop. It was a deeper, bone-deep exhaustion. It was in the slump of his shoulders when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture of profound fatigue. The magnificent facade was cracking, and underneath was just a man. A tired, angry man trying to hold the pieces of his world together. He was trying to reseat a heavy panel of mahogany, his muscles straining against the awkward angle. His grip was slick with sweat. I saw the panel start to slip, a slow, inevitable slide towards the stone floor where it would surely shatter. I didn't think. I just reacted. My hand shot out, closing over his to steady the wood. The first touch. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't romantic. It was a purely functional collision of flesh and bone, born of necessity. But the effect was catastrophic. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm and detonated in my chest. His skin was warm, rough with calluses, and for a split second, his fingers tightened under mine. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. My hand on his hand on the wood. The weight of it all. My internal reaction was a symphony of panic. Heat. A sudden, blooming warmth that had nothing to do with the stuffy air in the basement. Salt. The sheer, unadulterated surprise of touching this person I had held at such a celestial distance. I could feel the frantic thrum of his pulse, or maybe it was my own. I couldn't tell where one of us ended and the other began. I snatched my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove. The motion was too fast, too guilty. The mahogany panel settled into place with a soft thud. "Thanks," he grunted, not looking at me. His voice was rougher than usual. I just nodded, my throat too tight to form words. I retreated to my side of the room, my hand tingling, burning. I curled my fingers into a fist, trying to trap the ghost of his touch, to understand the lightning it had sent through me. The silence that fell between us now was different. It was no longer empty. It was charged, heavy with the unspoken thing that had just happened. The work became our shield again, a place to hide from the echo of that touch. But something had fundamentally changed. The air was different. The space between us was no longer a void. It was a live wire. The turning point, the real shift in our strange, subterranean world, came later that evening. We had hit a wall, a complex series of counterweights and gears. The very heart of the illusion's timing mechanism was refusing to align. The blueprints were old, the ink faded, and one crucial section was smudged into illegibility. Julian wrestled with it, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt. I watched him, his jaw tight, his knuckles white where he gripped a wrench. "It's not working," he finally bit out, throwing the wrench onto the workbench with a loud clatter that echoed in the small room. He looked defeated. It was the first time I had ever seen him admit failure, even to himself. My moment came. This was my world. The gears, the weights, the precise calculations. I knew this mechanism not as a performer, but as a technician. I had spent countless hours studying it, memorizing its secrets. I took a hesitant step forward. "The schematics are misleading," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "They don't account for the change in material density from the original brass to this new alloy. The fulcrum is off by 3 millimeters." He turned to look at me, really look at me. Not as props, not as a pair of hands to fetch things, but as a person with knowledge he didn't possess. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, annoyance, maybe, at being corrected, but it was quickly replaced by a grudging curiosity. "Show me," he said. The power dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the director, and I was no longer his stagehand. We were collaborators. I moved to the mechanism, my fingers tracing the lines of the gears, explaining the delicate balance required. He listened, his head bent close to mine, his attention absolute. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and I had to fight to keep my hands from shaking. I was in a position of care, of support. I was fixing not just his prop, but a small piece of his composure. The playing field, here in the belly of the old theater, was finally level. We worked side by side, our hands often brushing as we adjusted the tiny, intricate parts. Each touch was a small aftershock of the first, a reminder of the current humming beneath the surface. With my guidance, the mechanism finally clicked into place. The sound was soft, a satisfying metallic sigh of alignment. Julian straightened up, running a hand through his already messy hair. He looked at the repaired gearing, then he looked at me. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, and it transformed him. The hard lines of his jaw softened, and his gray eyes warmed. It was like seeing the sun for the first time after a long winter. "I couldn't have done that without you, Leo," he said. He used my name. He said my name, and the sound of it in his voice was a revelation. It was the key turning in a lock I didn't even know I was trapped behind. We worked late into the night. The city outside muted its roar, and a heavy rain began to fall, drumming a soft, hypnotic rhythm against the thick foundation walls of the theater. The world shrank until it was just the two of us in that small, warm circle of light, surrounded by the sleeping ghosts of performances past. The air grew thick with unspoken things, with the shared exhaustion and the quiet victory of our repairs. I had brought a thermos of coffee, a small habit from a lifetime of late nights. I poured a cup for him in the tin lid and handed it to him. Our fingers brushed again. This time, neither of us pulled away. We sat on the dusty floor, our backs against the cold stone wall, the restored cabinet standing before us like a silent monument to our strange, shared endeavor. The single-work lamp cast our shadows long and distorted against the opposite wall, making us giants. The silence returned, but it was a different kind now. It wasn't the tense, awkward silence of the beginning. It was a comfortable, lived-in silence. The kind that exists between two people who no longer feel the need to fill the space with noise. He was the one who broke it. His voice was low, stripped of its usual stage-commanding resonance. It was just a man's voice, quiet, a little rough around the edges. "My father built the first version of this box," he said, staring at the cabinet as if he could see through the wood into the past. He was a magician, too. The great Juliano. He said the name with a complicated mix of reverence and resentment. He wasn't much of a father, but he was a hell of an engineer. I didn't say anything. I just listened. I sensed that he wasn't talking to me so much as he was finally letting the words out into a space that felt safe enough to hold them. I spent my whole childhood in his workshop, which was a lot like this one, only messier. I never saw him more animated than when he was working on New Illusion. He could make anything seem possible with gears and springs. But he couldn't. He couldn't fix the things that were broken in our family. He took a long sip of coffee, his gaze distant. When he died, he continued, his voice dropping even lower. He left me all of this. The name, the illusions, the pressure. Every time I step on that stage, I feel like I'm just a ghost performing his tricks, living his life. I'm terrified that one day the audience will see it too. That they'll realize I'm just a fraud, hiding inside my father's box. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and shockingly vulnerable. This was the man behind the curtain, the secret heart of the machine. The magnificent facade had crumbled away completely, and what was left was someone lonely and scared. Someone who felt like an imposter. Someone I suddenly understood with a clarity that stole my breath. He finally turned his head to look at me. The work lamp caught the moisture in his eyes. "You're the only one who's ever seen how it all works," he said, his voice thick with a meaning that went far beyond the mechanics of the box. "The false bottoms, the hidden compartments. You see the real thing." My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My own fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but his vulnerability was a fire, melting it away. This moment was too important for my usual retreat into silence. "I don't see a fraud," I managed to say, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "I see the man who builds the magic. Your hands, they're not his. The work is yours." The space between us tightened, the air crackling with a sudden, intense gravity. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, a mixture of surprise and something softer, something that looked like hope. The rain hammered against the building, isolating us completely. It was 10 at night, a secluded barn in a storm. It was our own private world. He leaned in. It was impossibly slow, a hesitant, questioning movement that gave me 1,000 years to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, mesmerized by the approach of this celestial body I had only ever worshipped from safe distance. When his lips met mine, it wasn't a collision. It was a discovery. It was tentative, soft, and breathtakingly honest. There was no practiced smoothness, no performer's confidence. It was just Julian, questioning, uncertain. He tasted of coffee and dust, and a loneliness that I recognized as my own. I felt a lifetime of unspoken longing unspool inside me. My hands, of their own accord, came up to cup his face, my thumbs tracing the sharp line of his jaw. He made a small sound in the back of his throat, a sigh of surrender, and deepened the kiss. It was still slow, still searching, but now there was a current of desperate need underneath. It was the kiss of two solitudes, finally touching. A breakthrough, a quiet, world-altering consummation of everything that had been building in the dark. The next morning, the world felt sharp and new. The rain had stopped, and a sliver of pale sunlight found its way through a grimy basement window, cutting a bright line through the dust motes dancing in the air. We finished the last of the repairs, our movements synchronized, a new, unspoken rhythm between us. The silence was back, but it was heavy, laden with the memory of the night before. When we finally hauled the last piece of the restored cabinet upstairs and reassembled it on the main stage, the change was jarring. The harsh, bright work lights of the theater felt like an interrogation. The vast, empty space felt cold and impersonal. Our basement world, our bubble of intimacy, had burst. Julian was different. He straightened up, his shoulders squared, the invisible mantle of the magnificent settling back over him. He ran a hand over the polished mahogany of the cabinet, his expression unreadable, professional, distant. I stood there, my heart a lump of cold dread in my throat, waiting for him to say something, anything, to acknowledge what had happened between us. He turned, his gray eyes brushing past me, not quite making contact. "Good work," he said, the words clipped and formal. And then he walked away, towards his dressing room, leaving me alone on the stage with the silent, repaired box. The crash was instantaneous and silent. My world, which had felt so brilliantly reconfigured just hours before, collapsed into dust. It was a mistake. The thought screamed through my head. A moment of weakness in the dark. A fluke. He regrets it. The spiral of doubt began, a sickening, dizzying descent. I replayed every moment from the night before, but now, under the harsh light of morning, it all looked different. His confession seemed like a calculated manipulation to get the box fixed. The kiss felt like a temporary lapse in judgment, an aberration he was now trying to erase. My own vulnerability felt like a pathetic, foolish display. I had misread everything. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. Of course. Why would someone like him, Julian the Magnificent, be interested in someone like me? I was the quiet, awkward prop guy. A shadow. I was useful, and last night, I had been useful in a new way. Now that the job was done, I was disposable again. The next 2 days leading up to the residency's opening night were a special kind of hell. A period of absolute, crushing silence. Julian avoided me with a surgical precision. If he saw me in a corridor, he would abruptly turn and walk the other way. During technical rehearsals, he gave his notes to the stage manager, who then relayed them to me, as if I were a foreign dignitary requiring an interpreter. We were separated by a chasm of his own making. The solitude I had once cultivated as a protective shell now felt like a prison cell. The quiet of my backstage world was no longer peaceful. It was empty. Every corner of the theater held a ghost of the closeness we had shared. The dusty smell of the sub-basement, the taste of coffee, the sound of the rain, it was all tainted. My old life was gone, not because it had been replaced by something better, but because the possibility of something better had been shown to me and then cruelly snatched away. The absence of him was a physical presence, a weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I was back to being unseen, but now it felt like a punishment. Opening night arrived like a death sentence. My stomach was a tight, writhing knot of bees. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I did my final checks on the props. All I wanted was for the show to be over, for the residency to end, for me to pack my bags and disappear back into the anonymous life I had before. 10 minutes to curtain. The theater was humming with the energy of the arriving audience, a sound that usually excited me, but now just made me feel sick. I was in my small workshop, just offstage left, trying to focus on cleaning a set of linking rings, when there was a sharp knock on the door. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew who it was before I even opened it. Julian stood in the doorway. He was in his full stage costume, the tailored black coat and silk vest making him look impossibly tall and imposing. But his face was stripped bare of all performance. The confident mask was gone. He looked pale, nervous. He looked as scared as I felt. He just stood there for a moment, his gray eyes searching mine. The silence stretched, thick with 2 days of unspoken fear and regret. "I'm a coward," he said finally, the words a low, rough whisper. It wasn't the apology I had expected, but it was something more. It was a confession, just like the one in the basement. Honest, unadorned. He took a step into my small workshop, closing the door behind him. The space was suddenly charged, electric. "Leo," he said, and my name in his mouth was still a small miracle. "What happened?" "In the basement. It was real. Too real. He started pacing, a caged animal in my tiny room. My entire life has been about control, about building walls and crafting illusions so no one can see the man behind the curtain. It's safe. It's all I know. He stopped and faced me, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. And then you. You just walked right through all of it. You didn't even knock. You just saw me. And it terrified me. My anger, my hurt, all the self-recrimination from the past 2 days began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of aching empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting the feeling. He was scared of the light. I panicked, he said. I went back to what I know. Hiding. Pushing people away. It's what I do. It's what my father did. He took a deep breath, and the sound of it was shaky. But these last 2 days, this silence, it's been worse than any fear. The thought of going out on that stage tonight, knowing you're in the wings and I've broken this. I can't do it. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers gently touched my cheek. The contact was a spark, reigniting the warmth I thought I had lost. I don't know how to do this, he whispered, his thumb stroking my skin. I don't know how to be real with someone. How to be with someone who sees all the wires and the mirrors and still stays. His eyes were pleading. But I think I want to learn. If you'll teach me. The call for the top of the show blared over the backstage intercom, a jarring intrusion into our fragile moment. He didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on mine. And in that moment, I knew. The fear was still there, a cold hum in the back of my mind. But underneath, it was a fierce, defiant hope. I had a choice. I could retreat back to my own shadows, or I could step into the light with him. I leaned into his touch, a small, simple gesture of acceptance. Okay, I said. Just that one word. It was enough. A wave of relief washed over his face. So profound, it was like watching a great weight being lifted from his soul. He leaned in and gave me a chaste, desperate kiss on the forehead. After the show, he promised. And then he was gone, striding out the door to face his audience, leaving me with a racing heart and the ghost of his lips on my skin. The show was brilliant. He was electric, his performance imbued with a new energy, a new lightness I had never seen before. I watched from my usual spot in the wings, but everything felt different. I wasn't just watching a magician perform his tricks. I was watching Julian, and I knew that when he stepped into the quantum leap cabinet, the man who would emerge at the back of the theater was the same man who had stood in my workshop, vulnerable and real. The finale arrived. The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that shook the old theater to its foundations. He came back for his final bow, bathed in the white-hot glare of the spotlight. He drank in the adoration, his face flushed with triumph. He took his bow, a deep, theatrical flourish. Then he did something he had never done before. He straightened up, holding a hand out to silence the crowd. They quieted, expectant. He gestured, not to his lovely assistant, not to the orchestra, but directly into the darkness of the wings, directly to where I was standing, half hidden behind a curtain. He pointed right at me. My blood ran cold. What is he doing? His microphone was still live, his voice booming through the auditorium, clear as a bell. Thank you all, he said, his eyes finding mine in the shadows. But none of this would be possible without the real magic maker. My partner, Leo. The word hung in the air. Partner. It echoed through the theater, through the stunned silence of the audience, and straight into my heart. It was a word with 1,000 meanings. Professional. Personal. It was ambiguous enough for the public. But for me, for us, it was a declaration. A public display that defied the shadows. A symbolic gesture. A promise. A spotlight operator, confused but obliging, swung a beam in my direction. I was caught, exposed, blinking in the sudden, blinding light. The audience, sensing a moment of genuine emotion, erupted into a fresh wave of applause, this time directed at me. Julian was smiling, a wide, brilliant, unguarded smile. And in that moment, under the gaze of 1,000 strangers, I didn't feel the need to be invisible anymore. A few weeks later, the residency was over. The trucks were packed, the theater was dark, and we were in Julian's apartment. It wasn't the lavish, theatrical space I might have imagined. It was surprisingly simple, almost Spartan. Clean lines, uncluttered surfaces, and a lot of books on engineering and physics. The only truly magical thing about it was the morning light that streamed through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes in a way that reminded me, just for a moment, of our basement workshop. I was making coffee in his kitchen. The simple, domestic act felt more profound and more intimate than any kiss we had shared in the dark. The smell of the brewing coffee, the clink of the ceramic mugs, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. It was the soundtrack to a new kind of life. He was sitting at his kitchen table, not in a costume, not in anything but a faded gray t-shirt and jeans. He was sketching in a notebook, the pencil moving in quick, confident strokes. A new illusion, perhaps. He looked up as I placed a mug in front of him, and he gave me that same smile from the stage, the real one. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice soft in the morning quiet. I sat down across from him, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. I thought about the man I used to watch from the shadows, that distant, untouchable star. I thought about the broken box in a dusty basement that had, in its own way, broken both of us open and then put us back together, but in a new configuration. He was a disruption, a plot twist I never saw coming in the quiet, carefully curated script of my life. He had dismantled my solitude, brick by brick, and in its place, he was helping me build something new, something shared. "I was just thinking," I said, meeting his gaze across the table, "about how strange it is. How sometimes the thing that you're most afraid of, the risk you'd never dream of taking, turns out to be the very thing that saves you." He reached across the table and took my hand, his calloused fingers lacing through mine. The touch was familiar now, a comforting anchor in this new world. There was no jolt of panic, only a deep, steady warmth. This was our new routine, a domestic intimacy more magical than any trick he could ever perform. Sleeping in the same bed without anxiety, sharing meals, the easy silence of two people who were simply happy to be in the same room. This was the new beginning. My old life, my safe, solitary life, was gone forever, and I realized I didn't miss it at all. My transformation wasn't about finding someone to complete me, but about finding someone who was brave enough and scared enough to meet me in the middle of my own carefully constructed walls and show me the door. He didn't save me from my loneliness. He showed me that being seen wasn't a danger, but a destination. I look at him now, sketching his impossible dreams in the morning light, and I wonder, is that what real magic is? Not the deception of the stage, but the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of letting someone truly see you, of letting them see the gears and the wires and the mirrors, and having them call you magnificent anyway. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about keeping yourself safe. When you spend your whole life hiding, how do you learn to handle the light?